Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Keep It Clean Product Advisory webinar. Thank you all for joining us here today. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I'm Heidi Dancho, the Director of Communications at the Canola Council of Canada here in Winnipeg, and I'll be moderating today's session. As an export-driven industry, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable access to major international markets. Crop protection product application decisions are an important part of that, and that's why we're here today. The Keep It Clean Product Advisory is an excellent tool to guide growers, agronomists, and agri-retailers, and we trust that you'll find value in today's session. Before we get started, I'll review the Zoom webinar system and explain how to participate in today's event. So on your screen, you'll see a chat tab and a Q&A tab. Please use the chat tab for hellos and general comments, and if you're having any technical difficulties during the webinar, and please submit your questions through the Q&A tab. We'll be reviewing those and responding to those at the very end of the session, but please submit your questions as we go along. And if we don't get to your question during the Q&A portion, we'll follow up with you via email, and you can always feel free to reach out to us anytime at info@keepitclean.ca. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording of today's session will be emailed out to all the participants and posted on the website keepitclean.ca. Before we begin the session, let's pull up a quick poll just to see who we have online with us today. You can please fill out the poll. Please let us know who you are in the poll. And then if you're able to post a comment in the chat window to tell us where you're joining from today as well. Just give another minute here to fill out that poll. Okay, can we bring up those results? Okay, that's great. Oh, wait a minute. This is, I'm not seeing the right results here, unfortunately. But we do have some good comments coming in from across Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Yeah, I'm still getting the wrong poll come up, unfortunately. Right, well, maybe we could get that resolved, but it's great to see everyone joining in today from across Canada. Thanks so much for joining. We do have quite a bit to get started to go through this morning, so we'll get started. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'd just like to introduce our speakers. So today we have 3 speakers with us to provide timely information about which crop protection products may create market risk in 2023 and how the Canadian grain industry is working together to mitigate these risks. I want to welcome Greg Bartley, Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality for Pulse Canada, who will review the crop and product combinations that may cause market risk for pulses. Krista Zuzak, Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada, who will review the crop and product combinations that may cause market risk for cereals, and Ian Epp, Agronomy Specialist at the Canola Council of Canada, who will provide an update for canola, along with some important tips on following the label when applying crop protection products this season. I will pass it over to Greg and Krista to start us off with reviewing the importance of these practices and the process to determine market risk. Over to you, Greg.
Perfect. Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for everyone joining the webinar today. It's great to see so many participants, and definitely keep going into the chat there where you're from. It's glad to see where everyone's joining from and happy to see so many faces here. So to get things started, if you've joined a Keep It Clean webinar before, typically I like to start right at the start in terms of, why are we doing this? And it really comes down to the need for Canadian agriculture to export our products to export markets. So as you all know, Canada's crop protection far exceeds our domestic demand for food. So we need to be able to export our markets. So how much do we export? Just on average, when we look at a high level, it's over 90% of our canola is exported, over 80% of our wheat, and over 85% of our pulses. In some cases, we're exporting over to 130 different countries across the globe. So, we are export dependent, and that's why we're having this discussion today. Next slide, please. So when we look at crop protection products, unfortunately, there may be some market risks to the use of those products here in Canada, and that's why we're kind of gathered here today. So why do we see potential market access issues with the use of crop protection products? Well, it really comes down to our need to meet the needs of our customers around the world. And unfortunately, these needs aren't necessarily the same as what our Canadian regulations are, and this can cause concern. So why do we see this misalignment in terms of these regulations? It really comes down to 3 points that I've highlighted here. The first being the erosion of science-based approach to crop protection products in certain export markets. Now, I have 2 examples on the slide here. The first that I like to point to is really within the European Union, and it's the EU's farm to fork strategy. The farm to fork strategy has a clear target related to crop protection products, and their aim is to reduce the use and risk of pesticides by 50%. So reduce pesticide use by 50%. Unfortunately, this does have implications to Canadian production, as the way that we see some of this reduction targets being met is through the removal of products from the market. And when those products are removed, it has MRL implications. The other example I have here is related to Mexico. So a few years ago, Mexico released a presidential decree to ban the use of glyphosate and also ban the use of GM corn. Now, this decree has gone through a few iterations. It's still in progress, but what remains certain is that Mexico is still on path to phase out the use of glyphosate. This has implications. The other reasons that we see here is MRL policies in export markets are inconsistent, and I'll have a slide on this in a couple slides coming up. And also some commercial pressures towards pesticide-free products. We see in the marketplace that there's a move towards pesticide-free or residue-free, and this has implications. Next slide, please. So before we get too far, next slide, we'll touch on what is an MRL, just make sure we're all on the same page. So an MRL stands for maximum residue limit. So an MRL represents the maximum amount of pesticide residues that are expected to remain on a food crop when the pesticide is used according to label directions. And I always like to come back to that last part, used according to label directions. This is why it's so important when you hear the messages to always read and follow the label. It's not just about good stewardship of the products. They do have residue implications, as when the MRL is established, it's based on the maximum use pattern according to that label. So if you remain within the label requirements, typically that means you'll meet the MRL. Now, an MRL is not a measure of food safety. That's not what it's meant for. It's primarily used for trade purposes. And the key thing about MRLs is that we must meet the MRL requirements in those destination markets. So even though we have MRLs in Canada, we're always looking at the MRLs in those export markets. Next slide. So what about the MRL policies in export markets? So this is where we do see a lot of our trade issues arising from, is the inconsistency of how MRLs are applied in these export markets. So the policies themselves are inconsistent. And I have an example here on the slide that shows how these are inconsistent. It's also the majority of our export markets don't have a deferral pathway for missing and misaligned MRLs. So we can have, when it comes to MRL trade problems, it can arise from a misharmonization. So this is an example where an MRL is established in the export market, but it might be lower than the Canadian MRL. That's misalignment. The other example is just a missing MRL. So the MRL isn't established at all. And this is the greatest cause for trade concern, as even though any detectable residue is what causes that concern. So if we look at the examples here, I've just pulled up a few markets that give a picture of the differences in MRL policies. No particular reason for these markets, just to provide examples. So if we look at Canada, Canada establishes its own national MRL list. We establish MRLs here in Canada. We have a database. That's the MRLs we look at. We don't have a deferral pathway. So if there's a missing MRL, if the MRL is not on that list, then we have a default MRL of 0.1 parts per million applied. Now, if we look at a market like Italy, Italy doesn't have a national list, but they're part of the European Union. So Italy defers fully to the EU MRLs, pretty similar to a national MRL list. However, when we look at it in the case of a missing MRL in Italy, they apply default MRL of 0.01 parts per million, so lower than Canada's. This is very low and problematic when it's missing. Another example is the United States. Again, another national MRL list, but they don't have a deferral. So if it's missing, however, they don't have a default MRL. So there is no level that's applied. It goes down to whatever's detected. That's when you become non-compliant. It's problematic. If we look at a country like Brazil, this is where MRL policies get better. It's actually a good example to look at. Brazil has a national MRL list, so they establish MRLs. However, if there's a missing MRL, they defer to Codex when that MRL is not there. So Codex is the international standard where MRLs are established, and it's a great resource to point towards if you don't have missing MRL, or if you don't have the regulatory capacity to establish your MRLs. Codex is what you should use. Angola is an example of that. They don't have the regulatory capacity to establish their MRLs, so they defer fully to Codex, and they don't apply default MRLs. So just gives you an example, when you look at all the 130 different countries, lots of different combinations of how these MRL policies can be inconsistent. And it's really this lack of MRL deferral pathway and these missing and misaligned MRLs is what cause our trade concerns. Next slide, please. So what do we do? So as an industry, we're really trying to tackle this issue by managing the risk of MRL-related trade disruptions. And I like to break this down into a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approaches. Short-term being just ensuring there's no unacceptable level of trade risk. So this is where we review the market risk of crop protection products. Typically, this is annually. And Chris is going to come up next and explain, how we go through this review process. And if we identify any products that do pose an immediate risk, where we know if they are applied and going into an export market, it's going to be a non-compliance. This is typically where we communicate this through the Keep It Clean program, through webinars just like this. So being short-term, we can be nimble, we can tackle this year to year, but it really doesn't resolve any of the issues. So if we look at the medium term, this is where we work to attain the required MRL in the case of a missing MRL. So if we know there's an export market, it's missing, we really want an MRL there, so it's not causing concerns. This is where we communicate and collaborate with the product registrants. They have the data packages they can apply to the export market to get that MRL established. And it takes some time, 3, 4, 5 years. Unfortunately, it's not a very quick process. And it's really only works though if you're working in a regulatory capacity where you can actually apply for the MRLs. Long term, this is more of a broader multi-commodity, multi-country effort to really advocate for harmonization of MRLs. So this could be through Codex Alimentarius, again, that international standard that I mentioned. We could be advocating for regulatory cooperation, so make sure we have similar policies in all of our markets. We could advocate for get some MRL policies or MRL direction in trade agreements, things like this. This is where we work collaboratively through the Canada Grains Council, working with the Government of Canada, industry partners, really a full team approach here to make sure in the long term, can we get some harmonization of our MRLs and MRL policies in all of our export markets. And from here, we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Krista from Cereals Canada to walk you through the Keep It Clean program.
Thank you, Greg. Much appreciated, and happy to be here today to talk about the Keep It Clean program and how we work at setting some of the advisories that you're going to see on the product advisory today. So where we start is, as Greg mentioned, kind of one of the short-term efforts that we do make is the Keep It Clean program. So what we see with the Keep It Clean program is it's a joint initiative that is shared amongst the commodity organizations. So we have Canola Council of Canada, Pulse Canada, Cereals Canada, as well as the Prairie Oak Growers Association, all working together to really try to provide that information and those resources that will help growers and agronomists in different parts of the value chain to grow market-ready crops. So that's the tagline for Keep It Clean. And as Greg mentioned, even though this is a longer term, but also kind of one of those shorter term goals, it is something that provides updates. So the annual update to the product advisory, or perhaps if we have a particular concern for that growing season or a past growing season, we're able to make those updates and make those communications. Next slide, please. So one of the key parts of this when we think about our product advisory and what we're looking at is it comes from one of our 5 simple tips, which is use acceptable pesticides only. And we think about that, like, what does it really mean to use an acceptable pesticide? So as per the policy that I'm going to explain to you, as well as thinking about Keep It Clean, this is not only using pesticides that are, registered for your certain crop type and registered in Canada, but it's also thinking that further step about, which products might create trade concerns and how can we avoid that if possible. One of the big parts of that is about talking to your grain buyer. So ensuring that we, are using those products that are acceptable in domestic markets, but are also useful to our export customers. And as Heidi mentioned, we are so export dependent that this is something we really do want to focus on and want to protect. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our policy. This is the policy that kind of helps govern how we make these categorizations, and this is something I'm going to walk you through today. So this market acceptance of pesticide use policy, it's a Canada Grains Council initiative, but really with everyone from the value chain at the table. So again, it's something that was developed to be a little bit more proactive because also, as Greg mentioned, there are a lot of kind of those non-tariff trade barriers, and something like residues or MRLs can quickly add up and also become one of those. So this policy was developed with the value chain agreeing to it, and it is a voluntary policy, and it really wants to strike that balance. So that balance between having reliable access to foreign markets and not using crop protection products that could cause a market access issue, but also having availability to the latest crop protection products. So when these, a new active, or maybe there's a new use pattern on a crop that's launched, it's something that we also want growers to have that availability to manage pests and to take care of those issues in their fields. But where is that balance that we strike? So what we're looking for essentially to address this is some predictability. So thinking about where that trade risk might land and where those products are. In addition, with the policy, there is a steering group that meets, so kind of a MRL leads that meet together, and these are composed of the National Commodity Associations. We have grower organizations, we have exporters, life science companies, and retailers. So really just keeping in mind that this was developed collaboratively and to keep bringing everyone together at the table to be working on these decisions. Next slide, please. So when we think about our MRL assessment committee and what are the components of it, again, similar to the policy explains the development of an MRL assessment committee. So Pulse has one, Canola has one, and cereals have their own MRL assessment committees. And what we do is, again, the goal is to sit down and have a collaborative discussion. So as was mentioned previously, registrants have these data packages, and even though these are very important to understand the crop use pattern, when it might be applied, what the residues look like, all of those considerations together, there's more that we bring together on it. So we do have the registrants with their chemistry under review, but we also bring in the grain handlers and shippers as part of having that conversation with your grain buyer. We also bring in the ag retailers who will be, making some of these recommendations about the products. And then we also think it's very important to have grower representatives on there as well. So we do also have farmer board members that join our MRL assessment committee to be able to weigh in on these decisions and join these discussions. So really what that all means together is, getting together, reviewing the data, reviewing the information, and we create this assessment from it. So for example, I'm the lead of the cereals MRL assessment committee. So I would present the assessment, we would review it, and we would talk about what kind of categorization we would make. So the next slides I'm going to show you are what that looks like when we create a categorization, or how do we go about that. And just to note, in the right-hand side, you might see there that, if we have a category that can't be decided upon, there is parts of the policy that refer to what next steps we take on that as well. Next slide, please. So when we kind of think about how we determine risk, the easiest way to break it down is kind of these 3 steps. So we think about, what are the key countries we need to worry about? So what are those markets of interest that we're looking at? And these do differ by crop. Next, we look at what pesticides, might be of interest. So, which have residues of concern, and we'll break it out a little further about new versus existing pesticides. And finally, this 3rd step is really making that categorization. So it's that predictability, that, where is the balance of, what is acceptable risk versus unacceptable risk. Next slide, please. So when we look at our markets of interest, as I mentioned, they're specific to the crop commodities that we look at, but there are kind of four main categories that are laid out in the Canada Grains Council policy. So we kind of start off on the left-hand side in the top with our standard setters or policy leaders. So these are kind of our key influences, like the biggest players in the game. So Greg already led us through deferral pathways and what that might look like. So we also think about, Codex, the US, EU, and Japan. So these are kind of the big important ones, especially something like Codex. And then we think about significance to the value chain. So on the right side, so these would be markets with export potential, or our high value markets. And so these have some criteria built in through the MRL policy and through the Canada Grains Council of how we identify what those high value markets is, what that dollars per year of purchasing power essentially entails, that we would want to think about maintaining that important market access. Also, similarly, we do have a major export destination. So this is an average over 3 years of exports, a market that would be more than 5%. And this is identified annually by the value chain. So for example, in cereals, we would determine it for wheat, barley, and oats, versus in pulses, they would do it for peas and for lentils and for chickpeas. And it might change a little bit from year to year, but generally have quite consistent customers, but always wanting to stay as current as possible to where we are going with our markets. And finally, the fourth market of interest that we consider would be those that are undergoing policy change. So these are nations that are markets that are changing their MRL policy. They might be adopting nationalist, or they might be, for example, somewhere like South Korea has a lot of 0.01 or default MRLs. And as we see them establishing MRLs, this would be something as undergoing policy change. So something we want to monitor for if we're seeing these changes happening, that we keep up on them. Next slide, please. And then we get down to our pesticides of interest. So from here, what we're looking at more or less is like an inverted funnel. So if you saw the 2022 or an earlier product advisory, that's generally where we start with our new and amended pesticide registration. So if we have a new active on the market, we'll work with the registrant on that, versus previously categorized chemistries. So last year for cereals, for example, we had 4, and then we have one new one to add this year. So when we're going through our pesticides of interest, we're also reviewing the active ingredients that are already on advisory. As we work our way down the funnel, there are essentially some criteria for exclusion before we get to what we look at. Because if we think about how many actives might be registered on a certain crop, it can be an awful lot to be looking at. So we need some criteria built in for that. The first exclusion criteria is ignore if no residues. So essentially, this is anywhere that we have a Canadian MRL that exists of 0.01 ppm. Or parts per million, we would exclude those pesticides just because we already have such a low MRL. So that would fall into the category of no residues. The next one we would move down to is, as Greg mentioned, kind of alignment versus misalignment. So if we have, pesticides that have MRLs that are at or below those MRLs in the markets of interest, we would also exclude those, because those would be considered a tight MRL or somewhere where, we have stricter standards in Canada, essentially, so those would not be a concern. The next space we move down to into the inverted triangle is ignoring if no residues, on the basis that when we see that residue data, there were no residues produced, or there were non-detects, for example. So again, without having those residues present in the registration data in field trials, for example, that's something we would examine and be able to eliminate that from the next criteria that we were looking at. And then finally, when we get down to that little yellow end of the triangle, it's about limited acres. So if we have less than 5% application that we're looking at, whether that year or that's what the target launch would look like, that is also something that has an exclusion criteria. Just thinking about blending, if it goes to the bulk system or the small amount applied, there can be a lot of factors that work into that, but that is also an exclusion criteria. So finally, after going through all of those parts and thinking about, where those low risks are, what we really want to focus on are those ones that might have some kind of a risk that we need to think about. So those become our pesticides of interest that carry on to the next step. Next slide, please. So when we're determining risk, we talk a lot about residues and residue data, but it's not just about residue data. So kind of our acceptability of risk is broken down into kind of 3 subsections. So the likelihood of residue, even though it's the primary driver. We also have factors like handling and shipping, and then we also have kind of destination and end use considerations. So thinking about the likelihood of residue is not just the residues detected, but also something like the pest pressure. So if we have a really important pest like Fusarium head blight, for example, this is something that we would really want to consider what those residues look like and not restricting a product on that, because it's an important tool we would want in wheat or in barley, for example. And from there, when we look into handling and shipping, this might kind of break it down into something where, what percent is shipped bulk versus shipped in containers. So what this has to do with whether it's pulses or another crop is if something is shipped more in containers, we often see more of that residue concentrating because we don't have that bulk blending to blend out some of those residues. And then finally, on the destination or the end use, again, that might be other mitigation measures, or it might be thinking about the regulatory system of the market it's going into. Next slide, please. And finally, this is where we land on our product categorization. We can think of it like a bit of a traffic light scenario. So once we've kind of reviewed and taken all these factors into consideration and had a fulsome discussion about where we think this should land for a categorization, we have kind of a green means go or a no recommendation. As per the policy, we have amber or yellow, which is a be informed, so a use caution, and then we have a red or a do not use. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide that there's some of the criteria that fall into it, but thinking about something that doesn't have a recommendation, this is something that might have, a low likelihood of residues. Perhaps it has well-established or harmonized MRL, so it's something we're not concerned about. And ultimately that recommendation going forward is that the chemistry or crop use pattern would be accepted by all grain exporters. Versus the red or do not use would be more along the lines of, that there is this elevated risk of MRL related trade disruption. So we would choose to put a categorization on this as this is something that would not be accepted by grain exporters, and that, growers would be advised, not to use that chemistry in that particular way. The be informed is kind of that middle ground, but something that still requires a categorization. So this is more along the lines that treated grains may not be accepted by some exporters. For example, this might be something containerized, but essentially still there are, times this product might be able to be used. So this is when we would really encourage growers to be talking to their grain buyer before they're using this product. Next slide, please. And this is what our 2023 Keep It Clean product advisory looks like. So as we're going to walk you through for each commodity, there's the categorization and then the information about kind of the impacts of your crop protection decisions on the front page that we'll walk through today, and that will also be live on the Keep It Clean website. Next slide, please. So from here, I'm going to launch right into the product advisory for cereals. So I have 5 updates. I'll try to get through them fairly quickly, so we have time to talk about the pulse updates and the next ones we're going to go through. So we're going to kick it off with fluopyram. So this is an existing advisory from last year. There are no changes to this advisory, but essentially what we see is we might have some MRL related marketing risk for barley that's treated with fluopyram involving some markets. So as a result, we always advise you to consult with your grain buyer before using this product. On food and feed barley, it's an amber or a be informed to make sure you have that discussion, versus on malt barley, it is a do not use. So it has a red categorization on malt barley versus that amber on food and feed barley, and on wheat it is a green. So it's acceptable. It's an acceptable pesticide for wheat with fluopyram. Next slide, please. So new to our advisory, the next one we have up is tetraconazole. So again, similar to fluopyram, it's a green. There's no recommendation for tetraconazole, or pardon me, there's no recommendation for categorization. So it is a registered and an acceptable product to use on wheat. The concerns here again are with barley, so both malt barley and feed and food barley. So because of some missing MRL, so you'll see in the table on the bottom left, we are missing a Codex and a China MRL. This creates a concern about MRL marketing. So for this, we do advise against the use of tetraconazole on malt barley and barley for this growing season. And as well, grain buyers won't accept barley in either category if it's treated with tetraconazole. Next slide, please. So chlormequat, this is another existing advisory that we've had on there for a few years now, and again, essentially unchanged. So despite having MRLs in markets, there is some MRL related concerns that still arise here, and these also are on barley. So chlormequat is registered and acceptable to use on oats as well as on wheat. However, for malt barley and barley, this is a conversation to have with your grain buyer before you're applying chlormequat, because there may be some marketing restrictions for that. Next slide, please. And next up is pre-harvest glyphosate. So glyphosate, again, kind of remains as something a little bit different. So what we notice is that there are established MRLs, and it's not necessarily an MRL alignment or misalignment or a missing MRL issue. With pre-harvest glyphosate is more of a market acceptance concern, we might think of it like. And this has, scrutiny both domestically and in the global marketplace. So there are some possible restrictions on crops by a grain buyer. So what we see with pre-harvest glyphosate is a be informed for oats, wheat, and feed and food barley. So just keeping in mind of, again, having that conversation with your grain buyer before you're applying that product. And it does have a red, a do not use categorization for malt barley. So malt barley will not be accepted by grain buyers if it is treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. And maybe just one other part to mention, we do have a pre-harvest glyphosate section on our Keep It Clean website, but that glyphosate is registered as a pre-harvest weed control agent and is not to be used as a desiccant. So this can also create some concerns for residues. Next slide, please. And the final product advisory I want to go over with you for cereals is saflufenicil. So again, we have the MRLs that are established. And so again, this is more of a market acceptance or a marketing concern that also pertains to malt barley. So grain buyers will not accept malt barley if it's treated with saflufenicil. And this has to do actually with negative effects on the malting process, but it is acceptable on food and feed barley. So as I mentioned, when we talk about making these categorizations, that it's not just MRLs or it's not just residues. In this case, it's a conversation about the malting process and where that might go. So there's a restriction on the use of saflufenicil for malt barley versus it's, a green, it's acceptable and registered for use on barley as well as on wheat. And just a reminder that saflufenicil is not registered on oats. And with the next slide, I believe that wraps up the cereals product advisory. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Greg Bartley to give the product advisory for pulses this year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krista. So yeah, we're going to jump into the advisory related to pulse crops. Just a reminder, any questions, drop in the Q&A section. We will have a Q&A after, so it'll be great to get some questions in there so we have a good discussion. So for the first classification we have on the pulse advisory, it's a familiar product. Essentially all the classifications I have is actually the same as last year, so we're just going to go through them again this year. The first is Cethoxidum. So why do we have Cethoxidum on the advisory? We have it classified as a yellow for lentils and chickpeas, and this is due to some uncertainty in the European Union, where we're anticipating an MRL change and a residue definition change that'll drop the MRL to a much lower level. Now, I say it's anticipated because we don't know actually when this will happen. We just know that when it does happen, it's likely going to happen pretty quick, and it's going to create a challenge where we know that there's a good chance for detectable residues. So what are we communicating here? We're just communicating that folks should be aware about this. Since we don't know the timeline change and we know that lentils and chickpeas do have some exposure going into the EU, it's something that if you're working with a buyer that does service this market, they might have some considerations on the use of this product. That being said, though, there's a few steps that have been taken within the industry to limit the potential impact of this. So BASF already last year has replaced the Cethoxidum in their coal packs. and it's replaced it with a different chemistry. So we already know that that's already resolved in those co-packs that BASF offers. And we do know that some thizoxone-based products just aren't as available on the market as is. This is due to the EU issue and the likelihood of MRL changing. So something to be aware of. We have it classified as yellow on lentils and chickpeas, and we'll continue to evaluate as this progresses. Next slide. Next one is chlorothalonil. Definitely just want to highlight this one where it's a yellow on chickpeas, again, due to the European Union. New for this year, though, is the Great Britain has also looked at this MRL too. So the issue here is that the MRL has dropped to 0.01 parts per million. So the MRL has fallen to that default level. Now, when we first put this on the advisory a couple of years ago, we had some conflicting data sets where some residue data did show that there were detectable residues, and it's going to cause a concern. However, when we supplement this data with some real-world monitoring data, so when we take farm samples where we know growers have used the product, get a good indication of how they're using it, we're seeing that the residues just weren't showing up in those type of samples. So we're seeing as non-detect. So as we've dealt with this issue, I guess for a couple of years now, we've collected more monitoring data. We have a better familiarity of the risk level for this product. And we're seeing that it's not as high as we initially anticipated. We're seeing that the residues are continually coming back as non-detect. So we're still communicating it here because we know the risk is there. And if you're working with a buyer that is sending a lot of chickpeas to the EU, we just need to make sure that they're aware of this risk and make sure that we're not causing undue concern where it could be found. So what's the direction? If you're working with those buyers, just make sure that it's okay. We continue to use chlorothalonil, but they may have some concerns. So just be aware of it. The other part to this too is that domestically here in Canada, the PMRA did come out with a proposed reevaluation decision a couple years ago where they're proposing to cancel chlorothalonil, which would be extremely devastating for chickpea growers. I know the importance of this product for chickpea growers, and I don't want that to see. So just making sure that everyone's aware of that. We're still waiting on the PMRA to provide their final decision on this product. And we continue to hope for a positive outcome where this product remains on the market. So just highlighting that for everyone here. Next slide. The next one I just want to talking about is glufosinate ammonium. So again, this is a clear indication where we do know there are residue concerns and it will cause a trade disruption. So note the differentiation between the classifications between Western and Eastern Canada. Western Canada, we do know there's registration for some glufosinate-based products on lentils as a desiccant. And this is where we're recommending quite strongly to growers do not use this product. It's been documented, and we know that the MRLs just aren't in place in the export markets. And if it is applied, this will cause a trade disruption. We've seen it happen, so just avoid this one as much as you can. However, if we look at Eastern Canada, there is a registration on dry beans, and this is where we're communicating that, again, this yellow classification, need to talk to your buyer. The reason why we've maintain the yellow classification is we know there's a certain market class of dry beans going into the Japanese market where this use pattern is quite useful and we can meet the MRL requirements. However, new for this year though is we see that Japan has proposed to drop the MRL. So it was established at 2 parts per million. It's going down to the 0.3 parts per million, so much lower. However, going to come back to the use of real world monitoring data to help us support these types of decisions. Fortunately, we did have some companies that did have some monitoring data where they showed that when glufosinate is applied, we can meet this new restrictive MRL. This is good news. It provides confidence to the industry that we can continue to use this product in these certain situations and meet the requirements of the export market. So really good case of why good quality monitoring data is actually quite helpful to the industry in helping to make these types of decisions where it could be the difference between removing a product from use or allowing its continued use. Next slide. The next one I want to talk about is pre-harvest glyphosate. So again, similar to last year, we do have this classified as yellow, just be informed for all of our pulse crops with a differentiation between green and red lentils. So like Krista said for cereals, our MRLs are established in our export markets. So this really isn't an issue about regulatory MRL concerns. However, it's really due to this market acceptance of pre-harvest glyphosates that can cause potential problems and can be an indication where buyers might request pre-harvest glyphosate not be used. So we like to be forthcoming in these types of decisions and be transparent. So this is why you see this MA notation to go along this classification that just indicates, the MRLs are established, but again, it's this market acceptance issue that we're trying to deal with here. Now, in terms of the differentiation between green and red lentils, this is just an indication of where if you go to talk to your buyer, in most cases, we see that red lentils just don't seem to be the same concern. So in most cases, when you go talk to your buyer, it's going to come back as, yeah, you're okay to use this product. So we're just reflecting that within the advisory here, within the classifications. Now, like Krista said, it really comes down to proper use of glyphosate, and I cannot stress enough, getting the timing correct and using the product correctly, a pre-harvest glyphosate for weed control, not as a desiccant, is extremely important. So if you are using this product, it's a valuable tool, especially for that pre-harvest weed control. Just make sure it's being used correctly, and we'll avoid these types of trait disruptions. Next slide. And from here, I'm going to pass it over to Ian from the Canola Council, and he's going to talk you through some canola considerations and wrap up the webinar for us today.
All right, thanks, Greg. So the product advisory for canola, the same as last year, and actually kind of a good news story as far as where we are in canola. So again, like we've heard from Krista and Greg, and like Krista went through earlier in the webinar, we go through the countries of interest, the residue data, the acres, the actual pesticides being used, and then what the risk looks like. And for the 2023, we have no market concerns for products registered on use on canola. Again, this is for the exporting markets, so we are lined up and we have no products of concern, which is really a good news story. There's, again, a lot of due diligence that happens here and a lot of work that happens, but to have this result is really ideal for the canola industry and for growers. That's one less thing to worry about. So I'll talk about a few other things, a few other concerns maybe to keep in mind for growers. Next slide. So the first one is the Lambda update. So I guess this has been well covered in the news. This has been talked about for a while. So just the update as we get into here, we're right around the, into seeding, into the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of the 2023 season. The PMRA's reevaluation decision which becomes effective here at the end of the month. Crops treated with Lambda cannot be fed as livestock, right? So this includes seed screenings, aftermath, blending, and given that this is a really challenging decision or a challenging ruling from the decision from the PMRA for the industry, we're not a disaggregated there's a lot of interconnectedness in the grain value chain. So food, feed, there's blending, there's screenings, there's all sorts of things happening. So it's really challenging for a grower to know that any crop entering the grain handling system could be eligible for livestock feed. So this becomes a risk. This could pose a risk of being an off-label use. So again, if the grain is being exported, that works. It could be exported as feed, that works. Or if it's just for food, that use is acceptable. But again, not knowing where the products all end up, specifically any product entering the grain handling system could be turned into food, which is, again, challenging for grain handling companies, challenging for growers. It's a challenging decision for everyone here. So the Keep It Clean tips to try to help us through this process is use acceptable pesticides only, read and follow the label, make sure we keep up with the label, and then deliver what we declare when we have that declaration when we go to market our grain. So if you need more information regarding Lambda or any of the things you've heard, keepitclean.ca, we have resources there. Definitely consult with your agronomist as far as maybe depending on the specific pests you're looking at, Lambda being a insecticide. Well, you need to pull a trigger on an insecticide in season, and what pest, what insect you're looking at, what crop. And if you need more information, definitely reach out to Canola Council, Cereals, or Pulse. I think Greg, Krista, and I are your point persons there. So, especially as you get into the season, if you do have further questions, haven't found the right information on keepitclean.ca, definitely reach out to us and we can try to walk you through the process of what that might look like if you're in that situation. Next slide. So a couple other tips, things we need to keep in mind. These are kind of standard Keep It Clean tips, but really important to kind of refresh as we get into the next season here. So reading and following the label, all of the work you've heard from Greg and Krista on residues, on what's acceptable, that requires that when we do our due diligence that we're following the label. If we follow the label with certain products, so the right rate, timing, and the pre-harvest interval, we know what the residue is going to look like or the range of residues. And then we know that that's acceptable. We've done the work with the international markets. We know we're good there. But again, that's all predicated on following the label. So again, something like rate, we need the right application rate. If we end up with a higher rate, there's a chance we'll have higher residues or residues we haven't anticipated, and then we could have a market issue. Next slide. Timing, you've heard from Greg and Krista both on glyphosate. Again, in the canola world, I guess a very similar story where glyphosate is under a lot of scrutiny, and we really need to get that timing right. It is for weed control, not as a desiccant. And so that 30% or less moisture, because glyphosate's really flow mobile, if we apply any earlier, it really translocates in the plant, which from a weed control perspective is really good. You want to be killing the roots of your Canada thistle, or, you really want to, that's where we get a good job on some of these harder to kill weeds with glyphosate. But we don't want it to be the plants as they're drying down or translocating a lot into the seeds as they're making that final push for yield. So again, waiting until they're dry enough that phloem translocation has slowed down enough. So in canola, that's 50 to 60% seed color change. But again, for all crops, where glyphosate is a really important tool for us, and it's under a lot of scrutiny, so we need to be sure we're applying that correctly. For other timing, just making sure we're following the label correctly. If it says it's a 2 to 4 leaf or something like that, that we're on the label. Again, applications that occur outside of those timing windows can affect residues. Next slide. And then the pre-harvest interval. Again, each product has a different pre-harvest interval. This is one that slips through the cracks. Early in the season, for a lot of our early season products, usually they all have pre-harvest intervals, but usually it's not a major problem. As we get closer to harvest, that becomes a bigger thing. So late season fungicides, desiccants or pre-harvest aids, and insecticides. I think insecticides are probably the one that are maybe a little bit sneaky. We don't regularly apply a late season insecticide. It's kind of, oh, I haven't had grasshoppers in 5 years or 10 years, and now I got to make a late season application for grasshoppers or any other of these late season insects. So keep in mind that quite often for these insects, there's 3 or 4 different products that are probably registered for most of them, but the pre-harvest intervals are quite a bit different, right? From 1 day up to 60 days. In the insecticide world, 1 day to 21 days is pretty common. So if you do have to pull the trigger on a late season insecticide, just be aware that while they're all registered and they all might work well from an agronomic standpoint, we have to be careful on the pre-harvest interval. And just be careful we have the right product in the shed, or as we get really tight on that, we have to be careful on which product we're using. So just something to keep in mind. If you need a quick and easy resource to look up the pre-harvest intervals, Spray to Swap Calculator is a really good one. Plug in your crop, plug in what you're using, and it'll give you the pre-harvest intervals for that product. It's also in the crop protection guide and definitely on the label. So you have other ways to resource it, but if you want to get it really quick and easy as you're sitting in the sprayer making decisions, that's probably the fastest way to access the information. Next slide. I'll turn it back over to Heidi for the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Ian. So yeah, now it's time for a Q&A period. If you haven't noticed, we do have a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. So yeah, please take a minute to enter any questions that you might have. Maybe while we're waiting, we did get that poll fixed from earlier. So maybe we can just bring up that poll while we're waiting, give people a chance to enter a question in. Let's see if we can bring up some of the poll results here. Okay, great. Yeah, so you should be seeing the results there. So this is great to see some good representation from across the different sectors in our industry. Great to see all the agronomists and ag retailers as well. As trusted advisors to growers on the use of crop protection products, that your role is really important here in sharing this information to our growers. So this is really great to see. Again, any questions, just put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them today. Okay, maybe I'll just get started with a few here. So I'm gonna pose this one, I think, to Greg. So how can marketing risks still be present if MRLs are already established in a market?
Yeah, so I think this gets back to more of that misalignment of MRLs I talked about. So, it's less of a concern, I think, when we have MRLs established, but if they are lower, that's where we can get problems. So if again, if you're getting to that maximum type use pattern, you're getting close to an MRL, you know, that's where it could see it close to that level. And if it's lower in that if it's lower to the level and someone's got a lower MRL, that could be it. That being said, though, you know, if you look at the glyphosate indication, you know, this is the market acceptance type issues too. So even though if regulatory MRLs are established, there might be certain situations where your contract requests certain specifications, and that could be a different consideration for that market risk.
Great, thanks, Greg. Krista, I'll put one your way as well. Is it the same if a product is listed as not registered versus do not use on the product advisory?
That is a good distinction to make, Heidi. So when something has that NR, the not registered in the little black circle on the product advisory, that one has more to do if it's a registered crop protection on that crop in Canada. So when we are making categorizations using the Canada Grains Council policy, they do only apply to products registered in Canada. So we use those two categories to make the distinction between a do not use has, you know, an MRL or a market risk that would have that red X versus a not registered would be not to use it anyway because it is not registered in Canada as a crop protection product.
Great, thanks Krista. There's a question here. If I used a product last year, am I okay to use it this year? Ian, maybe I'll pass this one off to you.
Yeah, so it's always good to double check to see whether a registration has changed, something has changed. And that's, you know, that's one of the goals of this product advisory, is just to bring awareness of changes that we have in the market. And we also do have products that'll maybe get the registration pulled or not renewed for registration. So in the majority of cases, the products you used last year are probably used again. You know, there's a few changes that happen throughout the industry, so most of them are, but it's a great idea to double check your crop protection guide, you know, keep it clean product advisory, make sure that label is still current. Obviously, if there's big changes or really sudden changes, there'd be, you know, we are trying to communicate. There's other groups you're looking for information, but always good to make sure it's registered because we do have products that do change year to year.
Great, thanks, Ian. A few more questions coming in. Do the product advisories apply only to crops destined for export markets as opposed to crops that will be consumed domestically? Greg, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Typically what we see in the product advisory, it is that export market type focus. You know, we're reviewing the MRL misalignment. So if we are looking domestically, typically, you know, obviously if a crop protection is registered for use, it must have an MRL applied with it. So as long as there's proper use, there's really nothing to communicate in terms of that market risk domestically. So yeah, typically what you see in the product advisory is really dealing with our ability to export our products and looking at those export market MRL misalignment.
Great, thanks, Greg. Another question here about kind of alignment. How likely is it to see more global alignment in the near future? And what can be done to create more global alignment? I don't know, Greg, if you want to just continue on there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer, but I'd like to see it soon. You know, again, there's lots of work to bring countries together, advocate harmonization, and this is happening. And I think there's progress being made. However, I do see some countries taking a step backwards and contributing to more misalignment, and this is frustrating to see. So while there's lots of work being done to get this alignment, I'm not sure how quick we'll see that total harmonized approach in the global marketplace. So that's why it's really trying to make sure that there's trade enabling policies in place, that even if there is misalignment, what can we do to make sure that when we are exporting our product with this misalignment, that we're not causing unnecessary trade disruptions. So might be the best we get, but unfortunately, I don't see complete harmonization in the near future.
That's great. Question here for you, Krista, related to cereals. What is the average percentage of farms using pre-harvest glyphosate on cereals? And if the MRLs become more strict in the future, what are the alternative practices?
Oh, I would say for that one, I don't know if I have a percent that I can rattle off offhand, but there is it is a large acreage or a percent acreage of our wheat crops that are grown that are using pre-harvest glyphosate for weed control. And that's something too I can follow up with offline after with some more information. But thinking about alternatives and if MRLs become more strict, we do see changes to MRLs happening in other in export nations. So just depending if it's a move up or a move down. So when we see them becoming more strict, often we will look at our residue data that we have from cargo monitoring, for example. And generally in Canada, we are still meeting those export requirements. So we would have to see them kind of driven down quite a bit. There is some research that does go into what alternative weed control might look like on wheat, but it's something that still we really do focus on kind of that compliance piece and that acceptance, and looking if we really do have residues with risk, and thinking about how long we've been using pre-harvest glyphosate for, and the large volumes exported. It's very rare to have a residue issue that arises from that, but that's definitely somewhere that our research does look.
Great, thanks, Krista. Just a question here around Lambda. So are there alternatives to Lambda for controlling pests, you know, in the different crops? So canola, cereals, pulses. Maybe Ian, I'll start with you there.
Yeah, for pretty much all of the pests that Lambda is registered on, we do have alternatives. Again, there's to be some nuances on how we apply them. You'd want to be a little careful, especially maybe on your pre-harvest intervals or the race. So again, there are products registered. In general, they work equally well, or there's a lot of interconnectedness in insecticides where they work fairly well, and you get kind of agronomically very similar results from a different product. So yeah, there are other products registered. Just be careful on, you know, it'll be learning a little bit of a new product. So different rates, maybe different timing, maybe different application, environmental conditions. I know some of them prefer warmer conditions or colder conditions. So again, maybe taking a bit of a look here early season through Crop Protection Guide, or consulting with your agronomist on what alternatives might best suited if you're one who has used Lambda historically. But yeah, there are alternatives available.
Great, thanks, Ian. Greg, Krista, if you want to jump in there as well.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, you know, when this issue first really arose or came back to light in November, that was one of our main concerns, is if this product is not available, you know, are there enough alternatives available to farmers? And, you know, I'm happy to see a bunch of the registrants come to the table and increase the supply. So, you know, we're going into the growing season, I think, in a decent place, knowing that the alternatives are available and hopefully at the quantities that can fill that demand, if you're in a scenario where you may not be able to apply Lambda. So we know that there is Lambda on the market, and it's still a legal use in many cases. So, but yeah, there's definitely some alternatives on the market. As Ian said, work with agronomists. Some work better than others. So definitely figure out what's best in your scenario.
Thanks, Greg. Krista, not sure if you wanted to build on that.
I don't think I have anything further to add on Lambda other than what Ian and Greg have already said, which is really like having those conversations with your retail and your agronomist about what those might look like. And that, yes, as Greg mentioned, we have heard from suppliers that they are ramping up to have supplies out there, for example, for cereals, if we're predicting a bad grasshopper year in some areas, that the companies are out there and responding.
Great, thanks, Krista. I have another question that came in for you here. So what is a trade name of a product containing tetraconazole?
One of the ones that comes to mind right away is Zelera FX. So that would be something that contains tetraconazole. It's something relatively new, so there are not a ton of products out there, but yeah, Zelera FX. So if you Google that and tetraconazole, you should be able to find there's only a few products out there right now.
Great, thanks, Krista. And I think that's everything for today. We're very close to the top of the hour here. I think I've caught up with all the questions. Oh, sorry, there's one more question that came in here. Which of Canada's major export markets, if any, have no restrictions on Lambda use or Lambda residues? Sure, if we have volunteers to take that one here. Greg.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of export market issue with Lambda, it's not an issue. You know, really, this is a domestic issue related to that domestic feed use. That's really the implications that we see with Lambda. So if we're exporting, in terms of export markets, we haven't seen export markets take a restrictive approach to Lambda. So really, the issue comes down to this domestic feed use issue.
Great, thanks, Greg. Yes, I think that's it for the questions. So. If you do have more questions that come up, you know, please reach out. Like I said, info@keepitclean.ca anytime, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So as you exit the webinar today, please complete the Zoom feedback survey that will pop up on your screen. So we really appreciate your comments to help us inform future webinars and keep it clean information materials that we're producing. As a reminder, we'll also be emailing out a link to the webinar recording and a reminder for that feedback survey in the next few days. And you're welcome and encouraged to please share that recording and any of our Keep It Clean resources with your networks, just to help spread this information as broad as we can. A quick heads up that Keep It Clean will also be hosting another webinar later this summer. That one will focus more on the pre-harvest tips and tools. So I hope everyone here can join us for that webinar as well. And if you're not already part of our Keep It Clean e-news list, you can sign up to receive our monthly email updates from Keep It Clean, including invitations to register for upcoming webinars on our website at keepitclean.ca. And finally, for those of you interested in getting CEUs for participating in today's webinar, we will be submitting a list of the CCAs who attended today's live webinar, along with the CCA numbers that we collected at registration. So if you happen to miss providing your CCA number when you registered, please just email us at info@keepitclean.ca, and we will make sure that you're added to that list. And on behalf of Keep It Clean, I want to thank everyone here today for joining our session. Thanks to our speakers for being here, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks so much.